Good morning, good afternoon. The webinar today is presented as a keynote speaker by Professor Christian Welzl. Professor Welzl is member of the German Academy of Sciences, Leopoldina. He is the political culture research professor at Leuphana University in Lüneburg in Germany. Professor Welzl is also President Emeritus and Vice President of the World Reserve Association. Welzl's research focuses on human empowerment, emancipative values, cultural change, and democratization. Besides his award-winning Freedom Rising book with Cambridge University Press in 2013, his most recent books include Democratization with Oxford University Press, together with Ron Inglehart, Patrick Bernharden, and myself. The Civic Culture Transformed with Cambridge University Press, together with Russell Dalton. Modernization, Cultural Change, and Democracy, together with Ron Inglehart at Cambridge University Press. This book was funded by the Rainer Koselleck Award of the German Science Foundation. Welzl currently finalizes the monograph Cool Water, the Geoclimatic Source of Western Exceptionalism. The preprint is accessible at www.coolwatereffect.com. Within the International European Union Research Program on Trust in European Democracies, with the acronym TRUDEM, Professor Welzl is the leader of the German team, as well as the leader of the Work Package 4 on democratic systems and national cultures, transition and interplay of values. The topic of this keynote presentation and speech of today's webinar of Professor Welzl is Cultural Background of European Democracies, Examining the Roles of Values and Social Inequalities. You have the opportunity in the chat box to raise your questions and statement during the talk of Professor Welzl, or you can, in the question and answer period after the talk, raise your hand and give your questions or statements. Without any further ado, Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christian, for the nice introduction, and thanks for the attendees to joining this meeting. I'm sharing my screen now because I have prepared a little PowerPoint. It's actually not that little, it's 32 slides. We'll see how far I get with that. What you see here is just the official title, to which we are obliged by the rules of our project. The actual title, however, is this, at least for the article that we are just preparing and finalizing to get it submitted to a journal. Right now, we think of the European Journal of Political Research. That title will be Mass Polarization, Institutional Distrust, and the Breakdown of Democracy, ? Debunking a Commonplace Dystopia. So this is kind of a novelty for my own research, because I have never worked on a report and a paper whose main purpose is to debunk or disprove something that is highly popular as a narrative, and getting increasingly popular as a narrative in academia and also in public discourse, which is basically a falling or erosion or a crisis of democracy narrative that is now abound almost everywhere where you go. I try a little bit in the beginning as a theoretical background to dissect or bring pieces together, how from different research angles. No one so far has presented this narrative as a whole, as an entity, but we try to do by putting together various pieces that come from electoral research, but also from institutional analyses, party politics, public opinion research, and so on. The simple version is kind of what I called earlier, something like the democratic stress chain, with 4 hypothetical connections in this. The starting point for most crisis analysis, going back to Piketty or Stiglitz, the price of inequality is the socioeconomic divisions that have been rising in all post-industrial democracies since the early 1980s with Reaganomics and Thatcherism and other globalization and other developments. So the evidence is clear. Socioeconomic divisions within societies have becoming bigger and potentially are therefore a source for ideological divisions. May be possible. So this would be the link, the first link, that social divisions translate into value divisions, call it polarization here. Also, in a sense, and this is one of the theses in Pippa and Engelhardt's cultural backlash, that there are, in some voter segments, especially those that we might call left behind by all these modernizing, progressive, liberal, emancipatory policies that have been pursued, from same-sex marriage to openness to migration. Some voter segments feel overwhelmed, and maybe we can even identify them in terms of their socioeconomic profile. So people in more insecure, threatened socioeconomic positions in Rust Belt areas, in downtrodden areas, and with less education, and so on and so forth. And one assumes that among those voter segments, kind of a reactionary response, ideologically speaking, happens on various dimensions of ideological conflict, perhaps, to the emancipatory progressive trend of the mainstream. And that this polarization creates feelings of alienation, relative deprivation comes to mind, and that in turn causes distrust in institutions, the system, its representatives, and as a consequence, people might lose their sense of civicness. For instance, when it comes to democracy's liberal principles, which are supposed to receive less support or decreasing support, at least in some segments of the electorates. And then comes the third connection. This then informs or motivates a vote for populist parties, who then, last connection, when they come to power, they cut back on on democracy's liberal principles, what is usually called as democratic backsliding or democratic deconsolidation, or, to use the words of Ziblatt and Levitsky, how democracies die. Now, if we cut the cake with one of those possible fourfold tables, we can think of one cleavage on the horizontal, which we will see in this way in a fourth following graphics. Here we call it the trust cleavage. More to the right, people have more distrust, so they are disaffected from institutions of their system of democracy. More to the left, they have more trust, so they are more allegiant. And then on the vertical is just one of these cleavages about which ideological conflict seems to unfold more fiercely in recent years or even decades. It's one manifestation of a broader conservative versus emancipatory agenda, but I think this is the most important one, that is focusing on migration. So you can call it nativism versus cosmopolitanism, or here I said, or we said nation versus humanity. So wide scope solidarity, wide radius solidarity if it's more up, and narrow scope, narrow radius solidarity when it's more down. And then you get four different combinations. And if we think of right-wing populism, where would we locate this ideology? It would probably be the lower right quadrant in this ideological space, namely disaffected nationalism. So that's a little bit the background of our theoretical thinking. But if we get this narrative a little bit more detailed, it goes over those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stages. So we start with an emancipatory ideological progression, which is well proven through data from the World Value Survey and European Value Study. Over the last decades, we have seen a rise of emancipative values, liberal progressive values, especially among electorates, upper and center middle class spectrum, defined by higher levels of education for the most part. But then we expect an authoritarian ideological reaction among electorates lower middle class segments, mostly defined by less education, but also maybe by via income. And because of that, the distances, the ideological distances between different class segments of the electorate become bigger, which is what we call polarization. And then in those, or among those segments that are at the conservative or reactionary end on those probably multiple cleavages, develop three things. One is declining institutional trust. The second is declining support for democracy's liberal principles, so separation of power, press freedom, independence of judiciary. And then the third one is a growing readiness to vote right-wing populist parties into power. That's the narrative. And what we try to do in our work package 4 report, the first one that we released and now in the article version, is to check some of those linkages here and for their empirical plausibility. And we aim to do this in a cross-national comparative design with a longitudinal component, because we also want to look at change over time. What we actually did, we looked at all EU member countries, and we focused on 2 different time points that are about 20 to 25 years apart. So we choose as one focus, temporal focus, the late 1990s. And as the second one, the things as they are right now in the latest surveys that we have gotten in based on WVS/EVS. To begin with, and to get a grip on this idea that different class segments, different socioeconomic status groups in our electorates are affected differently by these developments, we need something like a socioeconomic status or social class index. And inspired by the recent work of Kitchell and Rehm and Armin Schäfer in Germany, we combined education and income, self-reported, of course, from the surveys. And we have education on a 9-point ordinal scale. We have income on a 10-point ordinal scale. And we had the impression that those fine-grained categories are not necessarily perfectly comparable across the different countries with the different income structures and educational systems. So we tried to simplify this a little bit more to make it more plausible, and we simply divided the education variable and the income variable in 3 parts based on the empirical distribution that we saw in both variables. Both variables, by the way, show a very bell-shaped single-peaked distribution in all the countries that we have at hand. So we divided those and that are in the lower third, coded low, 0. The ones in the center part coded 1, middle part, and high, those in the upper third of the distribution. And we looked where the cutoff points are based on the empirical distribution. And this we did with both education and income. Now, if you combine them into a joint education income class index, you get this 9-fold matrix, but you only get 5 codes. So it doesn't differentiate between all possible combinations. And we saw this as a problem, especially because much evidence shows that when it comes to differentiating people ideologically speaking on a conservative versus emancipatory spectrum. Whether you go to migration policies, sexuality policies, or environmental versus jobs, education usually has a stronger drive, so to speak, much stronger actually, than income. For this reason, we decided to combine education and income in such a manner that education is the prime differentiator and income becomes the second differentiator, so major, minor, if you like. And then we actually get 9 groups, as this matrix suggests. And they look like this. So we have from 0 to 2, we have a three-partite, so to speak, lower middle class spectrum. From 6 to 8, we have a three-partite upper middle class spectrum. And in the center, we have a three-partite center middle class spectrum. So we have these 9 groups. However, for all practical purposes, we cannot visualize ideological moves for each country over time for 9 groups. Also, because these groups carry different demographic weight, so they have different proportional sizes in their populations. So it doesn't make sense to plot even ideological moves of spectrums, like let's say 0.8 is really the upper class, that are only a tiny segment of the population. So we decided, based on this distribution in the right-hand diagram, we decided to focus on 3 groups. The most centrist, which is actually the gravity center of the distribution in the pooled data set, which is basically the center middle class. So middle level education, middle level income. And then we have 2 additional centers of distribution in their own hemisphere. In the lower hemisphere, it's the LMCA. So it's the lower middle class, defined by low education and middle income. And then on the upper hemisphere, it's the AMCB, which is the upper middle class, defined by high education and middle income. So we focus on those 3 groups because those are the demographically most heavy ones, so to speak. Of course, this distribution that you see here in the right-hand diagram is from the pooled individual data across all European countries. So from the EVS, you can imagine that these distributions look a little bit different. So for instance, in the Mediterranean South, it's more leftward skewed. In the Scandinavian North, it's more rightward skewed. So it varies a little bit, but this is the overall distribution. Now, looking at cleavages, of course, this project is about trust, institutional trust. For which reason, institutional trust will always be in the picture and how it developed over time across these 3 socioeconomic groups from country to country. So trust will be also always in the picture, but then we change with what else we plot trust. And we came up with 4 cleavages. One is the market cleavage. That's the old classic that has given shape to our center-right versus center-left party systems in Europe, social democratic versus Christian democratic or liberal parties, over the market versus the welfare state, over redistribution or low taxation. So here we said deregulation versus regulation of the economy. So here we use the classic 3 questions on distribution, ownership of businesses, and whether the state should make incomes more or less equal. So 3 items. Then we have 2A and 2B are actually one overarching conflict dimension, which we might call nativism versus cosmopolitanism, but it has in our data 2 manifestations. One is people's stance on migration policy. This is a question where people have 5 response options. So they're asked whether it starts with like, what do you think about your government's migration policies? Do you think, and please select one of the following 4 options. Let anyone come in. And then it becomes in an ordinal scale ever more restrictive as the numbers go up. That's one. Actually, we think it's the better kind of depiction of this nativism versus cosmopolitanism dimension, but it's not always available and for fewer countries. Therefore, we have a version 2B to get into the same conflict dimension. And here we ask how tolerant people are about so ethno-linguistic pluralism. This is based on the least like neighbor question. And here we looked at the items that address immigrants, people of a different race, and people of a different language, and summarize this into this cleavage. Then number 3 is the sexuality cleavage over restriction versus expansion of reproductive freedoms. Think of abortion, divorce, and homosexuality or same-sex marriage. Also 3 items here. And the last one is, we call it here the sustainability cleavage. It's basically economy versus environment or ecology. So here we say job creation versus environmental protection as policy priorities of governments. This is unfortunately only based on a single item where people have 3 response options. The question goes like, if government has set priorities, should always jobs have priority, or when the 2 come in conflict, should jobs always have priority over the environment, or should environmental protection have priority over economic growth, and then a middle option where people cannot decide which of the 2 they prefer. So unfortunately, this is only based on 1 item, but I think one can make a decent point that those are the important cleavages in all post-industrial mature democracies. At least this is what you get from the party politics, electoral, and public opinion literature. All right. Now, you can imagine we have 3 social classes, 4 cleavages, 2 different points in time, and 27 countries. So this produces this produces, if you multiply this with each other, we get an astounding 2,500 data points in the aggregate. And on the right-hand side, you get a depiction of the analytical matrix, how complex it actually is. So one challenge was, how can we get these data points into a visualizable overview of what is going on in terms of ideological shifts and polarization? For the report, we decided to break it down and not report all 27 countries, which we do, however, in the appendix, which is also available. And also for the article, we will just take from, so we assume, it's also based on work by Hans-Peter Krisi, we assume the European Union is basically divided in 4 geohistoric regions, where the whole process of Europeanization started from, the Benelux countries, France, Germany. So that's the Western core. Then we have later joining in the Scandinavian North, a bit earlier the Mediterranean South, and then the least group that came in as the post-communist East. You might think in chronological order, we should have placed Mediterranean South before Scandinavian North, because Spain and Portugal and these countries entered the European Union in the second half of the 1980s. However, the logic here is the similarity between these country groups. So Western core is more similar to Scandinavian North, and Mediterranean South is more similar to post-communist East. A dividing line here that we address in the paper is Catholic versus Protestant traditions in those different groups of countries. Anyways, so these are the 4 major geohistoric regions of the European Union. And then the idea was, for ease of presentation, to take from each of those the population richest population, the country with the largest population, which would be Germany, Sweden, Poland, and Italy for the Mediterranean South. But the Italian data were too patchy to use them in our matrix, so we decided to go for Spain instead. But actually, we would have otherwise taken Italy. Okay, these are graphs that Leonard has produced. Here we see the different social classes in different colors over the different waves of the EVS and WVS surveys. And on the horizontal, you see the trust cleavage. More to the left means more distrust. More to the right, it means more trust. So opposite polarity to the other picture I showed before. Sorry for that. And you can already see by the box that there has not been much change from the first to the last waves of surveys, even though one has to admit it's not perfectly comparable because the composition of countries has changed over time. So this is not held constant. But as a first take, you see there, it's hard to imagine that there was really a dramatic shift towards more distrust over these decades. Let me jump over this here. You don't here to see the 4 regions that we have covered. And here you see a pattern that will replicate itself later in the graphics, namely that the Nordic, so Scandinavian North and the Western core are more to the right of the distribution, so more trust, more institutional trust, while the ex-communist East and the Mediterranean South consistently are more to the left of the distribution. So less institutional trust. Now I lost my arrow. Here. And this is, we should relabel this, because what you see here on the horizontal is not the level of trust, but it's the change score. The change score. A minus means it has moved towards less, and plus means it has moved towards more trust. And when it's on the 0 line, nothing has changed. We see a slight evidence that trust has moved a little bit more to the left, but look at the scale range. The scale ranges from 0 to 1. And the changes that we see are minuscule because they are below minus 0.1. And again, it's not even clear if these numbers are comparable because the country composition is slightly different. Okay, now let's start with the mapping and tracking exercise. So the idea is to map the ideological positions of socio-economically differentiated voter segments on different cleavage dimensions related to institutional trust all the time, and then see how they changed over time, and do this country by country, cleavage by cleavage. To begin with, we didn't have a strong assumption about what will happen on the market cleavage in many countries, because we thought that the postmodern conflicts that we experience right now are really not about economic distribution. It is also in line with the theory of post-materialism, New Politics by Russ Dalton and many other authors, that we are now in an era where we have more cultural or moral than material conflict. So our assumption was the market cleavage will actually not show much evidence of polarization or change at all. And we took it in nevertheless because this is the classic cleavage, and from a cleavage perspective, one should have simply out of curiosity have a view on it. And now you always see the social classes. Green is the upper middle class, red is the middle class or center middle class, and LMC is the lower middle class. And When the dots are filled, it's the current position, and when it's just circles, it's the position they had in the 1990s, and the arrows show how they have been moving. So it's now for Germany. And this was surprising to begin with, because if you look at the trust cleavage, there is no evidence for increasing alienation, quite the contrary. All voter segments move towards more confidence in institutions. We were surprised by this, but this is what the data are showing. The only, and the distances have not become much bigger between the groups. So this also speaks against polarization. If anything, the upper middle class has moved farther towards more trust than the two other segments of the middle class. So there's a little bit more distance than before. One could take this as polarization, but then in a positive direction, because it's a polarization on a higher level of confidence than was there before. If we look at the vertical, we see a pattern that will repeat itself in the other countries. The socioeconomic segments of the electorates are not strongly differentiated on classic left versus right issues, or not anymore. I don't know how it was in the 1970s. We have no data for this. But already in the mid-1990s and today, you don't see very big differences, especially if you plot people on the whole scale range that is possible. So that was also interesting. Of course, the lower middle class is more up, so more in favor of intervention than the upper middle class. At least that was in the mid-1990s the case. But now the difference has actually vanished. So actually less polarization on that cleavage, and that cleavage actually doesn't differentiate so much. And that will repeat itself in the other three countries. For which reason I will go over this kind of cleavage in the other three countries, because it doesn't tell us very much. You will also see, when we can and have data, we plot supporters of the most important right-wing populist party into those ideological spaces in Germany, the Alternative for Germany. So where are they positioned? In terms of classic left-right issues, not much different from the bulk of the electorate, if at all distinguishable. But, and this will repeat itself also again, on the trust cleavage, right-wing populist party supporters are absolutely flagged out compared to the other voter segments. So this is one of the strongest distinguishing elements of supporters of right-wing populist parties. They stick out from the remainder of the electorate on the trust cleavage quite strikingly. That will repeat itself. What now happens, we always have the same on the horizontal, but we change the cleavage on the vertical axis. This is now the migration cleavage. Also surprising, there is no reactionary ideological shift to see. The assumption would have been, or the expectation, that especially the lower middle class either stagnates in its position on the vertical or goes even in the opposite direction. That means towards more exclusion, while the others move upward, in which case we would have more polarization, but we see the opposite. We have less polarization on the migration cleavage in Germany in the early 20s. Especially the lower middle class moved upward, so to a more progressive position. But then again, and this will also repeat itself with the Swedish Democrats, in the Peace Party in Poland, the Alternative for Germany sticks out by a pronouncedly less inclusive and more exclusionary position, so against migration on this cleavage. This was 2A. This is speaking to the nativism versus universalism or cosmopolitanism dimension. The second manifestation of this is the diversity cleavage. So again, to repeat, here we ask people about least like neighbors. So how tolerant are they of neighbors of a different language, a different foreigners in language, nation, and immigrants. So those three items, nothing has changed. And it's actually on the top of the scale. So 1.0 is, I have hardly ever seen something like this. 1.0 is the highest position for a whole sample as an average to reach, which means that almost every respondent must on all three items give the most tolerant response. Obviously, this seems to be the case in the German electorate. We are at 0.95 as a level. So tolerance, ethno-linguistic tolerance is widespread. But again, here the alternative for Germany sticks out even more than before on the migration cleavage. So they are far apart in their positioning from the remainder of the electorate. And this will become a general pattern. Right-wing populist supporters stick out on the trust cleavage as distrustful, except for Poland, I will show you in a moment, but for reasons. And on the migration and diversity cleavage, very strongly so. We go on sexuality cleavage. So this is about tolerance of reproductive freedoms. Here we see the pattern that has been documented many times in bigger aggregations of countries. There has been a progressive move upwards towards more emancipation in all voter segments, especially and more strongly even in the lower middle class than in the upper middle class. So also no indication at all for increased polarization. Here, the right-wing populists don't stick out that much. They are in the range of differences from the remainder of the electorate. And then the final one for Germany is the sustainability cleavage. So more upward means more in favor of climate protection, environmental protection, and more down, more in favor of the economy, job creation, economic growth. Also here, the right-wing populists don't stick out really. And interestingly, it's a massive move upward in the German electorate towards more emphasis on sustainability. On we move to Sweden. I'm not going into the market cleavage too much because I told you why before. Diversity, the same picture as in Germany. Although one difference is clear here, the Sweden Democrats do not stick out as much from the remainder of the electorate when it comes to diversity tolerance as do AfD in Germany. Unfortunately, we cannot depict the migration cleavage in Sweden, which is a pity because we found throughout where we have both diversity and migration, people are more tolerant of already existing ethno-linguistic diversity in their countries, then they are tolerant towards opening further, because this is looking into the future. So there is a difference in level. Unfortunately for Sweden, we cannot show it, also not for Poland and not for Spain. The migration question has not been asked in a way that we can follow its change over time. Sexuality cleavage, same picture as in Germany. Although the Swedes were already very far advanced, so their move is a little bit less pronounced, but they were already at a higher level. And here also the Sweden Democrats do not stick out as much from the remainder of the electorate. And then sustainability, a very strong move upward. And here the Sweden Democrats do actually stick out a little bit more. So, and that is also true for the market cleavage. And I was sweeping over this. So it's kind of interesting. The Sweden Democrats are not only on migration and not only on trust different from the remainder of the electorate. In contrast to Germany, they also differ a bit on the market cleavage, namely being more market friendly, more rightist, so to speak, and on the sustainability cleavage, being more anti-environmental protection. So the Sweden Democrats have an interesting position because they question two of the hallmarks of Sweden's policy preferences, namely pro-welfare state and pro-environment. Here the Sweden Democrats have obviously a niche in the market in the Swedish voting system. Now, the picture will change a little bit. We go to Spain, so southern Mediterranean South. Diversity cleavage, no indication for polarization because the changes are way too small to make a big fuss of it. And it's quite tolerant. Sexuality cleavage, the same picture as everywhere. On sexuality matters, the move into a progressive direction is universal throughout Europe, and I would actually argue throughout all mature post-industrial democracies. That's almost a universal for this corner or group of the world. Certainly not for for post-Soviet space and others, but for mature post-industrial democracies, this is a generalizable pattern. And no polarization. Distances have not become bigger. Sustainability, a bit of a move, but not so much. So it's a weaker move than in Germany or in Sweden or in the West European core and the Nordic, Scandinavian North. Now, switch to Poland. So this is also a pattern that is typical of post-communist Europe, more generally speaking. Trust in those countries has moved mostly towards alienation. And quite pronouncedly so. And this can be related to policy failures, the repercussions of the big economic transformations, soaring corruption rates, and these kinds of things that trickle down to the population and they perceive it, and it's trust is going down. And that's not only true for Poland. This is more or less representative for the entire post-communist East. Now here we see one interesting deviation. Law and justice is more trustful than the mainstream of the electorate. But this is easily explained, at least until recently, because law and justice is in power, was. Still is, but hopefully not that much longer. When Andrzej Duda will give the mandate to Donald Tusk, predictably to form a new government, we'll see how this goes. So here, when the populists are in power and actually for quite some time, then obviously that increases this voter segment's trust in the institutions, which is kind of logical. Diversity cleavage, also you would have assumed where populist parties are particularly successful, that this is the consequence of a reactionary ideological shift in the electorate. No, it is not. There is no such reactionary shift. Slightly moving upward and no bigger class differences than before. Sustainability cleavage, this is a peculiarity for post-communist East, for which Poland is typical. We see this in other post-communist countries as well. It's kind of a move from post-materialism to materialism, if you want to. So more towards, away from climate protection and more towards job creation. This not only typical for Poland, but also for Hungary and other post-communist countries. And here, the post-communist East really deviates from the other three regions in Europe, where we have seen mostly a progressive movement, particularly in the West European core and in the Scandinavian North. A bit less so in the Mediterranean South. But here, the post-communist East goes into a different direction. And we also see this, that Peace Party here sticks also out on this cleavage dimension from the reminder of the electorate. So the conclusion from this is there is no evidence for ideological polarization. There is no evidence for class-defined ideological shifts in a reactionary direction. there is no evidence for a generic universal decline of institutional trust. And we also checked in our questions on the meaning of democracy, whether there has been a shift away from support for democracy's liberal principles in an also polarizing way. This is in our appendix, but this evidence doesn't exist. What we do find is that voters, citizens who have less institutional trust, and voters who support right-wing populist parties, they are also less supportive of democracy's liberal principles. That seems to be logical. But there is no change over time in a direction that could lead us to the conclusion that, according to Foer and Maung, that there is a deconsolidation of mature democracies, in a sense that publics are turning their back to democracy's liberal principles. But we do have that strange finding that there is a cross-class soaring opposition in some voter segments to migration that is visible in the right-wing populist voters and their institutional distrust. But it's very hard. We tried to pinpoint, to nail down the socioeconomic profile of supporters of the right-wing populist parties. Yes, we know, on average, they are more male than female. They might be more educated, but even that is not that clear anymore, except for that university education seems to be work as a firewall against right-wing support or sympathy. But education does here not operate as a continuous variable, that a bit more you get, the more distant you are to right-wing populism. It doesn't work that way. It's only like when you get a university degree, then the percentages of support, then they drop. So this is the one distinction. And then a little bit with residential patterns. Also here, it's not a simple rural-urban divide. It's much more that metropolitan areas, so really metropolitan areas in Germany, like Munich, Hamburg, Berlin, Frankfurt, they would have lower support. But it's not a simple like urban-rural continuum that makes the division. So those right-wing populist supporters are hard to grab social demographically speaking. We looked at explain variances when we try to predict it for Sweden, for Germany with social demographic variables, and you get very low explained variances. So those things seem to have arrived in the middle of the population and also in the middle classes. In conclusion, that would mean that the success of right-wing populism cannot be easily explained with dramatic ideological shifts in the electorates, which is, however, often stated. In the media anyways, you hear it all the time, that publics, or at least segments of them, must have moved into a more reactionary direction over time in order to explain this. So the problems are not on the demand side or the electorate. By implication, this we did not back with data, but by implication, this is a logical conclusion. The problems must be on the supply side. And our hypothesis here is, and that is compatible with a recent paper by Rohrschneider, Pivley, and Whitefield, where they bring together, and this would be a next step that is important, data on electoral preferences, on ideological dimension with those of politicians or representatives. And they show, they ask the question, when do conservative, right-wing conservative parties, when do they pick up illiberal policies or propagate illiberal policies? And they find quite a lot of variation within Europe, EU 27. They find quite a lot of variation when and to what extent right-wing conservative parties are doing this. And not all of them are doing it, and to different degrees. And they find that the distribution in the electorate of illiberal preferences is the main explanatory variable. So there is a congruence linkage, apparently, that deserves to be nailed down. So our hypothesis is well, it's probably problems on the supply side. The going back to Peter Mayer, the pre-populist party systems had certain cartel tendencies. I would argue that created representation deficits vis-a-vis certain electoral segments, especially those people who feel strong opposition to, for them, too liberal migration policies. I think this is the quintessential issue here. And these representation deficits have accrued over time, so that kind of even center-right parties have out-liberalized, in a certain sense, their clientele in the electorate. I'm thinking, of course, of the CDU in Germany under Merkel, which made a very leftist migration policy. And then before, Schröder did a very rightist economic policy. So certain voter segments didn't see themselves picked up anymore by the pre-populist parties. And that wasn't a problem as long as the pre-populist parties had a monopoly in terms of gatekeeping, who gets access to the political arena, and also in terms of agenda setting of what gets a voice in the media. And and therefore, these voters have actually been ignored. And this has been shown by research by Armin Schäfer in Germany very convincingly. And then they went into the vote in the camp of non-voters and had no voice, and alienation and anger probably increased and was simmering. And then came the social media and simply broke the monopoly of the party cartels of the pre-populist time, and opened echo chambers and other ways for the Trumps and many others to get access into the political arena and give these voter segments a voice. They are just now mobilized back to the polls, so that the success of right-wing populism, in my eyes, is largely a mobilization phenomenon, rather than being explained with radical, dramatic ideological shifts in the electorates on whatever ideological dimension. Just to say it, we have to, of course, this is our next step, we have to back up this because it's EVS-WVS based. We want to replicate this mapping and tracking exercise based on ESS data. This is on our to-do list for sure. But also to show you this, what you see here is the, from Creasy's recent book. Also here you see no evidence for, on several conflict dimensions, on increasing polarization or on reactionary ideological shifts, even though he doesn't deal with social class so much. I think I leave it with that for now, and hope you found it somewhat not too boring, and very curious for comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Chris. It was a very fascinating talk. So now the floor is open for a Q&A session. Please raise your hand and indicate that you want to talk, or you can also write on chat. So we can start now the Q&A. But I can't see the participants. It's difficult for me to see who's raising the hand. People noise. People noise, do you want to ask your question from the chat? Yes.
There we go. So, so Chris, the thesis which I developed with Engelhardt, the cultural backlash thesis, isn't about changing in attitudes at all. That's to say, it's about changes in the electorate as a compositional effect. So it's about the groups who are there, what attitudes and values they hold, and particularly the idea, as you've argued, and as you've demonstrated in your work, that traditional values have become increasingly shifting from the majority to the minority in the electorate, due to generational change, social change, diversity in societies and things like that. So it's that shift which generates the resentment against establishment elites who hold the socially liberal views. And it's not really about social class per se. It's about generational changes. It's about changes in urban rural locations with the changes in urban areas, education and gender and so on. So most of the literature, I'd argue, on populism doesn't argue that it's individual level social class. Instead, it's about other factors in society which produce large scale cultural change. And any economic effects are very much macro level, in other words, to do with manufacturing areas of society, but not at individual level. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, I'm perfectly, thanks for the point. I'm perfectly aware of that, especially that the falling back regions, that this effect is actually happening at the aggregate level. So you see constituency percentage correlations, but it doesn't trickle down to the individual. I would perfectly agree with that. The thing is, I know that you made this point in cultural backlash. The thing is that there is still so many scholars around who still keep arguing that individual social class membership is a very important factor and make these statements, but don't demonstrate them. And therefore, I found it important to really go and take the pain and be really detailed in showing that much of this narrative is actually not true. I was thinking about the minority effect and how we can get an analytical handle on that. One idea was, and this would be still on our to-do list, is to look at group sizes. So to look at certain ideological segments of the population and how sizable they are in terms of their proportion in the population and how this has changed over time. And whether someone who has traditional values but is still in a relatively large group, let's say in Hungary, whether this person feels much less alienated, so on the trust cleavage, than a person who has traditional values but lives in Sweden. Something along these lines would probably be a good idea to follow up. I'm not having exactly a plan on how to do this, but we will discuss this in our group. So especially with Leonard, because he's methodologically very sophisticated. By the way, he has submitted last week his PhD thesis, a paper-based one, and it's excellent. So if he is in the group, congratulations. I don't see everyone. So congratulations again in this public. I hope this answers a little bit your question, Pippa. But of course, it's relevant.
Julia is asking if the article has been published or is when it will be published.
This we have to change a little bit in formatting. We are just preparing it for a submission. We thought we do this in January because Leonard wanted to finish his PhD thesis first, meaning by the end of December, but he has already submitted, so now he has free hands. So I hope we submit it to the European Journal before Christmas, and then, you know, it's unpredictable how the review process is going.
There's a question by Hans E. Jong. Hans E. Jong, please.
Mute here. Hello, Chris, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks so very much for your wonderful presentation. It keeps flipping in and out, but I guess the information is going quite clear now. I want to verify something. These cleavages which you mentioned classically, and I thank you for making those distinctions, but I have a feeling that these cleavages seems to affect the entire sovereignty or the entire system of the European Union system, and then it could have a conflict if it bounces back in terms of the general policies that govern the European Union system. What do you think about that?
I try to digest what you exactly mean, and I'm not 100% clear.
Let's talk about these cleavages which you spoke about elaborately and distinctively. We find a system where the sovereignty, of course, they share the pool, which has to disseminate information and qualities and values to the member states. And I try to find out, I see a situation where this cultural perspective gets into conflict with the sovereignty of the general EU system.
Ah, okay, now I get it. Yeah, actually, it would be good if we could also plot how much in favor people are of further European integration or to revert it back, because that would be also one of those cleavages that would play a role here. Unfortunately, we have not much data on that in those data sets, but probably in the ESS, in the Eurobarometer, for which reason this is the next step, and we could basically add to the cleavage scheme this one, especially on European integration versus more national sovereignty.
Okay, thank you. Dimitri has a question. Dimitri?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, this is Dimitri Sotiropoulos, University of Athens, Greece, and EUI Florence. Thank you for the wonderful talk. This is a question on the Alternative für Deutschland. In fact, two similar questions. One is, could you again explain, because you may have said it, what is the arrow of causation? One is a voter of the AfD, and because of this, we may deduce that this person has low trust, or it is the other way around. One has low trust, and that it can be shown to be causally related to voting for AfD. And the second question on the same issue is, do you have any evidence whether the voters of AfD showed low trust towards institutions and low support towards democracy before 2015, when the AfD made a dramatic shift, becoming a clear radical right-wing populist party? Thank you.
Very good question. Unfortunately, the latter question I cannot tell, because we have no data. And this was also a problem in some of the, therefore, we have the right-wing populists always plotted as only one dot and not a change over time, because in many countries they have not been coded in the earlier point in time. Also for Spain, we didn't have the Vox. Well, we would have liked to plotted Vox, but we couldn't. It was not coded, so I cannot tell where their institutional trust has been before. So that's simply a data problem. In terms of what I think where the causal error goes, I would think that it's very much related to what I said before in terms of representation deficits. I believe that even that exactly the German case is relatively clear in that sense, because if you think of like, just as an example, it goes back to class. Pippa doesn't like that so much, but just to illustrate the point, what the way of thinking is. If you think of the classic German working class people working at a factory assembly in the rural area, when you looked historically, where it probably is the same in the Rust Belt in the United States, so the coal and mining and steel producing areas, when you look where the vote of those people usually would go, the knee-jerk answer would be Social Democrats. But this has never been true. They were actually not even capable of getting more than 50% of the votes of those people, even though economically speaking, this was their target audience. A large vote of those people always went to the Christian Union, and because of the conservatism. And that means that certain voter segments could be picked up by the classical parties, center left, center right, either on economic issues, but only as long as center-left parties were also making policy proposals that are on the old left-right, according to their identity. Or they could be picked up by their moral conservatism. And this is why the Christian Union always had inroads into the working class. So when they were Catholic or morally conservative, this was something that made the CDU attractive, the Christian Democrats attractive for them. Now, these two parties move away. The Social Democrats on the economic left-right moves towards the right. So they have no more message to those voters under Schröder, Agenda 2010. And the CDU under Merkel, the Christian Union, moves to the left in moral questions and has no more message for those voters. And that, I think, was a point that created these representation deficits that drove some voter segments into the camp of non-voters that had no voice for quite a time. And then you got simmering anger, alienation, frustration that was probably fueling institutional distrust. But again, it found no voice. And then comes the time of the populists that then exactly mobilize those voters. I do not know how one can nail this down with data, especially in this sequence. But I think this is what was going on.
Thank you very much. Julia Sital-Dovna has two questions. Julia, please pose your questions.
Thank you very much. It is such a pleasure to be here with you, with my class on international and intercultural management here in Hochschule Fresenius. And we have several questions for you. Thank you for your talk. So did we understand correctly that the education becomes the main factor in how society stratifies itself, right? And how it works towards the unity of the nation? So the idea of incorporating diversity, incorporating migration becomes a part of universities or taught in universities or bred in universities, specifically with so many international students in our business schools and universities as well. So do you think that this actually is the way to integrate the smartest people who are coming to the country into the social levels? That was my first question.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good point. In our class scheme, this was a decision we made. Basically, a conceptual decision to give in the combination of education and income, to give the primary role to education and the secondary to income. But this was not completely out of the blue. We know from our analyses when we correlate differences between people in ideological terms, be it emancipative values or pro-environmental protection, you can take whatever you want. It's usually more closely correlated with education than with income, which for me means that the driver, when we go to socioeconomic objective characteristics, the driver of ideological differences into a progressive direction, education is the stronger driver than income. That was one premise. Now, if education can be a new dividing force in society, I think yes, and it kind of relates back to Pippa's question, because it's also becoming a majority-minority, a question of minority-majority distribution features. I observe, this is now own observation, that education can be very divisive, but not in a continuous way, but it's the watershed between people who are attending universities and everyone else who doesn't. I give you one example. We have debates in Germany that are led with such a ferocity among universities who are always in a liberal progressive bubble, which is, however, indeed a bubble. It's not the representation of the breadth of society. We have now, I had a confrontation actually in my classroom where people demanded me to use a gendered language in my lecture. And I said, I'm not doing this. And I explained why. And we had a discussion about tolerance and these kinds of things. If you go out of a university on the street in Germany, I have actually survey data about this, and ask people how meaningful they think the debate is about gendered language. They all shake their head and say they cannot understand it. So there are certain, but now we have 35% of the population attending universities. So the distribution, minority, majority, again, is changing here. And these issues are becoming more salient. What I want to say, however, is that university education or not can create certain detachment or decoupling effects, that you get an educated elite. And I think the idea about cartel tendencies in the established media and party system has something to it. Because right now, 95% of all journalists and politicians have a university degree, which means they went through a socialization process that is very different from 2/3 of the society. And they are in debates that some of the population cannot even understand. And this creates moments of decoupling, where I think sometimes, I'm not a supporter of populist parties, believe me, but sometimes they have a point, because they put the finger into the wound when they say anti-establishment, or the establishment. In some sense, that establishment actually exists in terms of decoupling tendencies. But this was more a political statement than a scientific one, I guess.
Yeah. Thank you very much. May I ask the second question? My second question would be, you showed how the nations get their strata, right? And my question is, how does propaganda, paid propaganda, social media propaganda, cyber war, troll farms influence the political choices and distribution within this national strata? Because we already have so many research that shows that the social media campaigns paid do have their own focus on right-wing parties and like their specific audience. So do you think that this is going to continue, and what is can the data that you have provide any kind of confirmation? Thank you very much.
Unfortunately, the answer to this question is a clear no. We don't have such data with the data with which we work. I have a personal opinion about that that goes in the same direction of what you hint to, but we simply cannot answer this question scientifically on the basis of the evidence that exists in most of the survey data, I would say.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask the team leader for the Polish team, Professor Agnieszka Turska-Kawa, and the leader of the Swedish team, Professor B. Puranen, who are both in presence, if they want to add something, because they are co-authors, and maybe they want to add some statements to this wonderful presentation of Professor Welzel. B or Agnieszka? Maybe B?
Yes. Yes. Thanks a lot, Chris. This was, as always, fantastic to listen to you. And I would like to connect maybe to the question that Pippa Norris was raising, thinking about the development in Sweden. It was indeed interesting to see how the Swedish Democrats were positioned in a different way in Sweden than in Germany, that you showed. And I do feel that we have left the spirit out of the bottle, so to speak, by using social media, making things that we didn't know was there under the surface, has now got a platform to debate from. And I sympathize a lot with that way of interpreting it. But in the same time, we can see now in the Swedish society that people take a stand against it. I mean, even if they are getting stronger and stronger politically, people are all even talking about having the populist leaders being a part of the government, etc. 37% of the people in a survey just done recently, this last week, said that they should be a part of the government. But at the same time, we have the other undercurrent going on with people actually being very strongly against this. So even if we can't see this polarization, and I do agree with your interpretation of what we're doing in this paper, that it is actually not a growing polarization. There is the contrary. The other standpoint is more passive, but resistant in its passivity, and strong because it's well grounded with very many people, and especially with the women. You can see it, women of all ages, I would say, elderly women as well as younger ones. And of course, education plays a vital role. But I would, if I put up the finger in there, I wouldn't be surprised if this silent resistance will grow even stronger. The Social Democrats are there, and they are growing too. But that is not a novelty, it's not an news, but they are growing stronger and stronger. And the other smaller parties are getting smaller and smaller. So I believe we will have a strong takeover in the future 5 years or so, up to the next election. And but the people that we need to talk about in our work, not in this paper per se, but in our team, our work package, is the migrants. And it's really a pity that we do not have that variable in the European countries, and we must make sure that that it will be in the EVS for the next wave of them, because it's so vital. But we have other variables that we could use to check on migrants, and I think that is something for us to mull on for a second paper to come, to focus a bit more on diversity, on migration. But so far, I mean, what Lennart has made these fantastic graphs of the discussions is really amazing. And I do thank you, Chris, for an excellent presentation.
Thank you. Professor Agnieszka Turska-Kawa is the leader of the Polish team from the University of Katowice. Do you wish, Professor Turska-Kawa, to add something as a co-author of the paper and also the reports for the TUDEM project?
Thank you, Chris.
She has actually been elected a member of the Polish Academy, so we should congratulate her.
I did not know that.
Thank you. Thank you for this. Congratulations, and thank you, Chris.
Congratulations, Agnieszka. That's great. Bravo.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris, for the great presentations. Well, actually, I have nothing to add because everything was perfectly explained, what was planned. But I would like to share with you my curiosity about the future research, especially in the Polish background, because now, as you know, we are under the big change of the government in the landscape, in our political landscape. So I hope, and probably in some time, in a few years, we will. It will be good to check it, the direction of the change of the trust cleavage in Poland, and then it will be very interesting to compare it with our current research. So probably in a few years, there will be perfect time to find the change, yes, the result of this change, but we'll see, and I hope it will be the direction of our future research. Thank you.
Thank you, Agnieszka. Are there any other comments, statements? I don't see anything on the chat box. Deepa, you want to comment before we close, and before Chris has the last word, as usual?
So this is really good research in terms of pushing forward, and I think the last comment in particular in the first part of the research on populism, we focus very much on the causes of populism and therefore what were the drivers and so on. But increasingly now, unfortunately, because of political developments, we can look at the consequences. And some of the things suggest that essentially the first time a populist gets into power, it doesn't matter that much, but over successive administrations, it has a big impact. And so when we talk about long-term change, just like generational change, I think that the impact of having different leaders, parliaments and cabinets is something that we can start to really look at in Poland, for example, but also elsewhere, for example, in the Philippines or in other countries where populists have come and gone. And I hope, therefore, we'll start to be thinking about that and the implications for TrustGov. It's not just one administration. If you're in power, like, for example, Viktor Orban over 3, it makes a big, big difference. So hopefully we can start to monitor these long-term shifts through the next survey of the World Values Survey and things like that.
Thank you, Professor Pippa Norris from Harvard University. Professor Norris is the co-PI of our TrueDem project. And the last word goes to the keynote speaker, Professor Chris Wenzel. Please conclude your webinar session.
Thank you, Christian, for the nice moderation. I like this comment of Pippa that we go more from the to look at populism from the DV side to the IV side. We had actually recently an interesting presentation from a scholar in our Tuesday seminar who does exactly that. And he was presenting populism or the success of populism as a threshold or filter problem. So like a funnel of filters. So first of all, he was showing, okay, even if we go to the most populist countries within the Western framework, not beyond, within the Western framework, we look at the most populist countries, which would probably be Hungary. Apart from Hungary, the real support base is usually not larger than something between 25 and 30%. So the first threshold is, how does this translate into a large share of parliamentary seats? And then, of course, electoral formulas play a huge role. So in proportional systems of government, they get their share, but they don't win the majority in the first filter. Then the next filter is if they are represented in the parliament, how likely is it that they get government power? Also, proportional systems are better here because they will become part of a coalition government usually, and not be the only party that is in power. And then he looked at which policy fields. So he created a matrix of policy success of particularly populist program points when they are in government. And it was surprisingly little. Apart from migration and these kinds of issues, it was surprisingly little, except, of course, when they have sort of absolute majorities, and then they can go into the constitution and its principles and not only change policies. But he was more focusing on really like policy change through populists in power. I found that very interesting. And it was relatively a little what they can refer to. But as Pippa hinted to, that can change in the future if more populist parties are in government for longer.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Wenzel, for this wonderful talk. Thank you, Professor Turska, Kava, and Puranen for the additional comments and contribution to the project. Thank you, Professor Norris from Harvard, who is the co-PI of TrueDem. Everything you wanted to know about TrueDem is on the TrueDem website. Please go to the TrueDem website. If you have questions, please contact the manager of the TrueDem project, Dr. Kisilova, and the video of today's webinar will be available on the TrueDem website. So if you want to hear it again, please go to the website and download the video. There you have everything recorded. Thank you very much. And I think it was a wonderful webinar. And thank you also to the audience for their questions, comments, and statements. It was a very lively debate, and we are very grateful for your presence and also for your contributions. Thank you very much indeed, and take care. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thanks for coming.